It's interesting, as I have already mentioned, that both of them make so much more of Kierkegaard than Heidegger, that both of them are closer to Kierkegaard's religion, though I think very far indeed from sharing it, than Heidegger, but that nevertheless, in spite of that, in basic orientation, they really have terribly little in common with Kierkegaard. And I might say that although both of them are clearly more attractive personalities than Heidegger, that both of them clearly have a kind of personal integrity that many of us feel Heidegger, if he had it, ever lost during the Nazi period, that for all that perhaps both Jaspers and Tillich are less radical, for better or for worse, than Kierkegaard, and then Nietzsche, and then Heidegger, and then Sartre. They see some of the elements of the modern crisis. I am not sure that they go quite so much to the roots of it as I think Sartre does. And now, by way of making a transition to Sartre, I might say that here again I think I'm submitting to you a minority view. I think it is on the whole fashionable to say that Heidegger, particularly if one hasn't read him, is surely the profound Teutonic thinker, while Sartre is merely the journalist who popularizes all this. I don't agree with this at all. I esteem Sartre not only as a human being, but also quite emphatically as a writer and thinker, much more highly than I do Heidegger, and higher also than Jaspers, and so I have selected him for more detailed treatment, partly out of regard for him. I'm now ready, finally, to deal with Sartre and the crisis in morality. Very briefly, first of all, a very few data about the man. He was born in Paris in 1905 and suffered the same fate that Nietzsche suffered in one respect. He lost his father as a little boy. His father died, and then he was brought up by his mother in the maternal grandparents' house, and there's something interesting about this. His maternal grandfather is an Alsatian, or was an Alsatian, by the name of Schweitzer, and Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Schweitzer are cousins, which I suppose few of you knew, and which I think is a rather piquant little detail. His mother remarried when little Jean-Paul Sartre was 11 and moved with a boy from the Alsace to La Rochelle, where he grew up. Then he absolved his military service, studied philosophy as a philosopher, as Heidegger had done earlier. He studied for a while with Edmund Husserl, the German Jewish founder of the School of Phenomenology, was very profoundly impressed by Husserl, and started out as a philosopher with a phenomenological orientation. He did some teaching before the war, and on the eve of the First World War in 1938 published his first novel, available in paperback, Nausea, followed it up the following year in 1939 with a collection of short stories, originally named in French Le Mur and in English The Wall, but then when it got to the paperback level, it was called Intimacy, and had a variety of rather lurid covers. But seeing that there are 5 short stories, one of which is called The Wall and one of which is called Intimacy, I must say that having read the 5, I think Intimacy is the more accurate title. In this case, it does not promise too much. I don't think that the stories are in any sense pornographic. I don't know that it is not misleading when the cover quotes a British magazine that said, leaves Lady Chatterley sleeping at the doorpost. but they are very frank and forthright stories which I think have points to make and which I happen to think, again a minority view perhaps, are very excellent and very profound and very interesting stories. He also published, before the war broke out, several philosophic essays, mainly phenomenological. Then he published what might be, without hesitation, called his main works during the war, chiefly L'être linéaire, Being and Nothingness, translated in full into English by Hazel Barnes and available in one big volume and very difficult to read in large parts, as well as a play that came out the same year, The Flies, Les Mouches, and about the same time another play, No Exit, and then any number of further plays, of which perhaps the single most interesting is the one Le Diable et le Bon Dieu, Lucifer and the Lord, or The Devil and the Good Lord. Also published quite a bit of literary criticism. In 1946, a lecture to which I shall have to recur when I start in a moment talking about morality, which is called Existentialism is a Humanism. And then what is probably his most controversial work, a long book on a man who was, at the time that this book was written, simply considered vile and a criminal, but who is now widely considered a party without ever belonging to it. He felt that if one was seriously against the status quo, that then one ought to make common cause with the one party, so it seemed to him, that was serious about overthrowing existing society and changing it. He never seems to have been under any illusions that surely his own head would have been one of the first to roll if the communists should have taken over. I think he did show on this rather abominable bad judgment. I think that there was a certain obtuseness about it, but it is interesting that he never followed any strict party line, but remained, as one would expect of him, all along an eccentric individualist. After Budapest, he welcomed, I think, the opportunity of having some cause now over which he could openly dissociate himself from the Communist Party. He did it in an interview that was published in English in, I think, the first issue of the Evergreen Review. It's very interesting to read. I think it's, to my mind, a somewhat dismal performance, which, again, although he now is anti-communist, does not, to my mind, show any political penetration or particular good sense. I don't think that this is the most serious matter that one can say about a philosopher. I would cheerfully say that Plato did not have much political good sense either, and it remains an open question whether a philosopher who is politically not very perceptive might not possibly be very profound in other matters. Now, what is the core of Sartre's philosophy? At that point, clearly, one has to make a selection, and people will differ about what is the core. I will suggest that perhaps the central idea of Sartre's philosophy is, and I will here, so far as possible, paraphrase him, that man is, in Sartre's fine phrase, condemned to be free. Man is condemned to be free. And the meaning of this comes out in Sartre's addition that man is constantly tempted to hide his freedom from himself and to live in bad faith. Call it bad faith, or call it, as I have done in my little anthology of existentialism from Dostoevsky to Sartre, in which the wall is reprinted along with the lecture on existentialism is a humanism, and Portrait of the Anti-Semite, the section also on bad faith from L'être linéaire, and I don't call it bad faith, I call it self-deception. It's no great matter. It means, I think, much the same thing. Sartre's point is that man tries to deceive himself about his own freedom. He tries to deceive himself into thinking that he is not as free as in fact he is, perhaps even into thinking that he is not at all free. What man craves, Sartre thinks, is a different mode of being altogether from the human mode of being. Sartre suggests that there are two modes of being, the ones that he calls, using phrases out of Hegel, out of the German philosopher Hegel, en soi and pour soi, the in itself and the for itself. But we don't need this particular terminology. We can say the two kinds of being are the en soi, the being of things, and the pour soi, the human mode of being. And things, Sartre suggests, have a mode of being that is characterized, or so at least it seems to man, by a solidity that men do not have. In this connection, I personally think that Sartre engages in altogether too much jargon, in unnecessary verbiage, which is modeled after Hegel and after Heidegger, sometimes also after Husserl, that's exceedingly academic, in the worst tradition of academic philosophy, and that in places can, I think, hardly be construed and figured out. But for all that, I'm very far from saying that that's all there's to it. On the contrary, my whole point is that in this forbidding shell, there are what I consider some very profound insights. What man, Sartre thinks, wants is the solidity that characterizes the being of things. Man wants to exist all at once. He wants to be there all at once, like a rock, like a piece of stone that's impermeable. He wants to have that kind of an identity. And when you have a quiet moment, when you are, say, by yourself, and suddenly realize that you could also be quite different from the way you are. Let's say you happen to be giving a lecture, or you happen to be a professor, or you happen to be a doctor or a lawyer or a businessman or what have you, that you really aren't a doctor, a lawyer, a businessman, a professor, or giving a lecture in the same way in which a stone is hard or in which water contains oxygen, but that it's up to you, up to a decision that you make, whether you remain that way. I could right now stop this lecture and walk out. I could right now resign my job. You could become quite different. You could give up the kind of career that you have had so far. You could suddenly decide that you will take the first ship on which you can get and go to Africa to do something or other, to work with Schweitzer, to make trouble in the Congo, any number of things. There are all these possibilities. Now one can dress up some of these possibilities in a humorous way and just be entertaining about it. But when it strikes home, when you suddenly realize that there is something of a fake security about your present mode of life, that it could suddenly be changed altogether, that's rather frightening. It's much more comforting to think, as for me, I am such and such a person. As for me, I happen to be a lawyer. Well, that's me. Or as for me, for that matter, I happen to be an anti-Semite, and there you are, and now make of that what you want to. Now, isn't that frightening? This is the kind of person I am. Now, while we don't necessarily adopt such aggressive views as Sartre's anti-Semite does, and as anti-Semites generally do, Sartre, I think, is suggesting that the anti-Semite that he sketches for us is merely characteristic of a common human tendency, that the way that the anti-Semite lives in bad faith is only an extreme example of a way in which most of us decline the full and frightening measure of their responsibility and somehow seek security in a spurious sort of solidity.